Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Professor Geiger.
I wanted to start with a joke this morning,
Recording in progress.
but I couldn't think of anything funnier than neoclassical microeconomics. So we're going to be covering the neoclassical school of microeconomic thought, and it begins with the classical school. Neo meaning mathematical, classical referring to the classical school of economic thought. And from the classical school of economic thought, we had the marginalist revolution with the marginalists, as well as the neoclassical emergence of economic thought. Oh, excuse me. We had the Marxian school of economic thought, and from the Marxists, it kind of went into the neoclassical school. So here, the neoclassical school economics builds on classical economics and focuses on the mathematical modeling of economic phenomena and the determination of equilibria through supply and demand. So this is where we really begin to see the supply and demand graphs. I believe it was Alfred Marshall who really developed some of those. We have the Austrian school with Carl Menger. Austrian economics traces its roots in the aforementioned marginal revolution and emphasizes the advantages of a market economy, a deductive a priori methodology in the science of human action, and methodological individualism, as well as the Keynesian school with John Maynard Keynes, which I'm going to be covering in the next lecture. Developed by John Maynard Keynes, this school of thought focuses on macroeconomic aggregates and active intervention via monetary and fiscal policies by the state to stabilize economic cycles. So some of the thinkers we have within the Austrian paradigm is Mises, Hayek, Rothbard, Kirzner. All three, Hayek, Rothbard, and Kirzner were students of Ludwig von Mises. And in the neoclassical paradigm, we have Coase, Friedman, Becker, Samuelson, Stiglitz. I think what's important to mention here, Hayek had a great essay called The Pretense to Knowledge, which was the idea that with the scientific revolution following Sir Isaac Newton, the economists had what was considered to be physics envy. So they wanted to be like the physicists because physics was considered the queen of the natural sciences. So the way that the neoclassical economists really approached economics was with the methodology of the natural sciences being physics, geology, studying, I guess, the natural elements of the world, and the social sciences, economics, things like, I don't know, psychology or philosophy may be considered, maybe not psychology, but philosophy or sociology, anthropology would be considered some of the social sciences. So the distinction, the primary or foundational distinction really is with the methodology, the approach to understanding economics between the Austrian paradigm and the neoclassical paradigm. And we'll go into some of these different aspects. So in the concept of economics, the Austrians view economics a theory of human action understood as a dynamic process, praxeology, the science of human action. The neoclassical paradigm is a theory of decision, maximization subject to restrictions. It's a narrow concept of rationality. So please.
I'm starting already. So just like if this were a species evolution diagram, was Adam Smith a common ancestor of both Austrian and neoclassical, or did they branched off after Adam Smith, or is there some other?
Yeah, essentially, I mean, in Murray Rothbard's History of Economic Thought, he bashes Adam Smith, but yes, essentially, they are a common ancestor. And then yesterday, lecture with Mark Skousen, who really enlightened me on the ideas of Adam Smith as a classical liberal philosopher. But Rothbard mentions that Adam Smith was a necessary precursor, more Ricardo with their objective theory of value, for Karl Marx. And obviously Marx economics is, I guess, polar opposites to what the Austrians believe in due to like their ideas on property and everything following from that. But yeah, Adam Smith as a classical liberal and economists and the idea of individualism, allowing for the emergence of markets to come about, is definitely a beginning line for Austrian thinkers. But then you have like the Spanish classics and the French physiocrats who like arguably, debatably, are more influential in the Austrian school, but yeah. So going off of this concept of economics, the neoclassicals have this concept of utility maximization under constraints. So they begin with the idea that we have this perfect knowledge and it's just about making decisions, whereas the Austrians are saying this dynamic process of the world is discovering new information and creating information. It's an endless process of combinations we can use with our resources, including our mind. It's an infinite capital, well of capital, if you will. But for the neoclassicals, economic models often assume individuals aim to maximize utility within their budget constraints. This assumption is fundamental to consumer theory and microeconomics. So we have these like curves, and it's essentially trade-offs between two goods, and we're searching for this concept of equilibrium. Equilibrium is very much a physics concept, whereas in the real world, we don't have this thing of equilibrium. So the whole premise of using mathematics is to model the real world. Instead of observing it and trying to understand, they have to resort to mathematics for clean equations that, yes, models reality, but it simplifies reality. It simplifies the human being. And this is what physicists do. They make models of reality, but they can't model consciousness and some of these essential elements to humanity. Ideological beliefs might prioritize non-monetary factors in decision-making. Religious doctrines may lead to avoiding certain types of consumption, cultural norms, and personal values. So this is the idea of subjective valuation, whereas for the neoclassicals, they think of decision and utility maximization as something objective to all people. Rationality and subjectivity. Neoclassical theory assumes individuals act rationally, making decisions to maximize utility based on their preferences and constraints. However, rationality is subjective, varying among individuals due to personal preferences, beliefs, values. The lack of a universal measure of rationality poses flows and aggregations in applying macroeconomic assumptions. Quantifying subjective preferences and motivations is a deficiency in economic analysis. So just think of the example, on a Sunday like today, is it better to go to the beach or attend this lecture? Well, through your demonstrated preferences, you decided to come to the lecture rather than the beach. Maybe it's because it's raining and you didn't want to go to the beach, so this was your second best option, but nonetheless, you guys are here and not the beach. On the methodology, Austrians have subjectivism, whereas the neoclassicals stereotype of methodological individualism, and they're objectivists. Yes, and this lays, again, the groundwork for a lot of the ideas about values that neoclassicals can't really develop, because as the Austrians really established, values are subjective, whereas to the neoclassicals it's all about maximizing utility. The protagonist of social processes. For the Austrians, it is the creative entrepreneur. For the neoclassical paradigm, it's this term homo economicus, which is this concept that man is robotic, he's almost like a penguin, and he's homogeneous, he's interchangeable. And if we just give him the right information or the right direction, then he will, of course, act in pursuing maximizing his utility. And a lot of the information that I have in these slides can be found in Professor Jesus Huerta de Soto's book, The Austrian School. I highly recommend. Concerns arise about neoclassical applicability to the real economy. Real-world economic behavior is often messier and less predictable. The neoclassical economic man, homo economicus, is robotic, highly rational, always maximizing utility or profit, predictable, behaves consistently based on mathematical models, unrealistic, ignores emotional and social aspects of behavior. Again, the neoclassicals have this concept of decision making, whereas the Austrians really refer to the term choice. You're choosing between an infinite amount of ends and means, and the neoclassicals are saying, well, you're just, with perfect information, deciding between some alternatives, but they really bypass the whole concept of means and ends heavily. The possibility that actors may err a priori and nature of entrepreneurial profit. For the Austrians, actors may conceivably commit pure entrepreneurial errors that they could have avoided had they shown a greater entrepreneurial alertness to identify profit opportunities, whereas the neoclassicals, regrettable errors are not regarded as such since all past decisions are rationalized in terms of cost and benefits. Entrepreneurial profits are viewed as rent on a factor of production. Within the Austrian school, a great book by Ludwig von Mises is called Profit and Loss. And that's two sides of the same coin that is very important in the capitalist system in utilizing scarce resources. The profits you make is essentially a signal of reassuring you that you're using society's scarce resources to satisfy the preferences of consumers. Whereas if you incur losses, this means that you're not doing the best job of satisfying consumers. Moreover, you could be satisfying consumers, but it could be too costly in your production structure of how you're going about it. So to reduce costs can help you become more profitable, and this can help you satisfy even more consumers in a market environment. But for the neoclassicals, their system of costs and benefits and profits is, I believe, really assumed. And they kind of forego the importance of these market signals and feedbacks of incurring losses and profits. So, in contrast, real individuals and firms are complex, influenced by emotions, social norms, culture, and psychological biases. For example, marijuana becoming legalized in the States and in California, you could become really rich selling weed, but obviously not everyone wants to do that. Why? Because of people's cultures or religious or ideas about drugs per se. So even though there's a profitable opportunity for someone to make, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone will act upon it. And there's many examples we could think of in that regard. But I think that speaks to cultural norms and the significance of that for a society and an economy. Unpredictable behavior affected by changing circumstances and limited information. Realistic reflect true diversity and complexity of human behavior. We don't always act homogeneously. We are emotional beings, or to the sense that we have emotion. It influences what we want to do and why we want to do it. We all want to pursue different things. Yes?
Hi. So the neoclassicals don't believe this. Like, is that what...
with their model of Homo economicus, they're modeling humans in an economy, in their consumption preferences, but they really are not taking into account, because how can you model subjective preferences and values and religious, cultural, ideological influences? So they kind of just have to assume it away or simplify it, because it doesn't fit into mathematical equations super well. And that's the thing that a lot of modern, so neoclassical economics is really what's taught in the modern American and European universities. And what it is has turned into 700 level degree calculus. So their whole theory is just beginning with assumptions about humanity and the real world. And frankly, I think that's why a lot of mathematicians who fail in math go into economics, because they're just doing math equations. But this whole concept of human action and subjective values and preferences and what it means to live in a society, I think is only really elaborated within the Austrian paradigm comparatively. And I do think, and I'll probably talk about this more in the Keynesian lecture, that the neoclassicals are coming from a school of economic thought that, well, frankly, I do think it goes in hand with political ideologies of their time, of the 1870 and 20th century. Communism, socialism was on the rise during these times, and so these were great ideas to allow for government influence and intervention in society and cost allocation for resources and things like this. But I'll probably touch upon that more in the Keynesian lecture. So the concept of information. What is information? And how do we obtain it? How do we control? How do we not control it, but contain it? Right? With the Austrians, knowledge and information are subjective and dispersed, and they change constantly. Entrepreneurial creativity, a radical distinction is drawn between scientific knowledge, objectivity, and practical knowledge, subjectivity. I like the example of riding a bicycle. I can show you a diagram or try to explain to you how to ride a bicycle, but it's this tacit knowledge that only by the practice of riding a bicycle will you be able to ride a bicycle. I like the example of Michael Jordan. I can tell you how to dunk, but some of us can dunk, some of us can't. Michael Jordan is going to probably be the best at dunking, comparatively. So, just because we have information doesn't mean we're all able to apply it ourselves to life. Moreover, for the neoclassicals, complete, objective, and constant information in certain or probabilistic terms on ends and means is assumed. Practical entrepreneurial knowledge is not distinguished from scientific knowledge. And I think this also speaks to kind of the humility of the Austrians and the idea that even if you're the smartest person in the world, you're still ignorant to 99.999% of knowledge. And everyone knows something that you don't. So you can always learn more. And someone who, whatever specialty or whatever occupation that they work in, has some knowledge in that field. And so that gives them their comparative advantage in what they do. This is why this specialization and division of labor is so beautiful and so essential for a flourishing society. Whereas for the neoclassicals, this idea of creative, subjective information has to be assumed away. We have to assume that we have all the information available to us and we're just, again, making decisions rationally. But even the term rationality for the Austrians is all action is rational, because we're demonstrating what we prefer and what we do, and we're not saying that just because someone does something it's irrational in regards to their ends. Of course, we can debate the means. How do you go about going somewhere? Let's say if you're trying to go to the beach, would you fly across the world and back again to get there, or would you just take more of a direct, shortest path, right? So this is like knowledge and information that we have to kind of create in our lives with the most medial tasks, the most remote tasks, as well as the more complex ones. In the reference point, for the Austrians, general process which tends towards coordination, no distinction is made between micro and macroeconomics. Each economic problem is studied in relation to others. Whereas the neoclassicals, the model of equilibrium, general or partial separation between micro and macroeconomics. So yeah, with the neoclassical school, they really focused on this concept of microeconomics. And then Keynes, a student of Alfred Marshall, said, wow, there's this whole, no pun intended, there's this whole hole of economics that's not developed, considered macroeconomics. So you have the neoclassical microeconomic framework and the Keynesian macroeconomic framework. But with the Austrians, we're saying there's no distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics. As Mises said, all exchange is foreign exchange. So a lot of this macroeconomic talk of GDP and aggregate trade surpluses and stuff within nations. Well, what if we had a nation for each person? So 8 billion, 7 billion, how many other people we have? A nation for each one. So then if everyone's trading, then this is all considered foreign exchange. And technically it would be macroeconomics, but at the same time, at the individual level, it would be microeconomics. So trade is this social network that can include everyone, but yeah, the neoclassicals and Keynesians really try to make this distinction, again, to suit their purposes, which we'll explain more. So the concept of competition. For the Austrians, it's a process of entrepreneurial rivalry. For the neoclassicals, it's a state or model of perfect competition. We assume that there's perfect competition, whereas for the Austrians, it's a process. It's a dynamic process. Like we were talking about yesterday, capitalism and competition has to be daily renewed of how to best serve your customers. And this concept of competition in the neoclassical framework is somehow perfect. Yeah. And the concept of cost, for the Austrians, cost is subjective, dependent on the consumers, depends on entrepreneurial alertness and the resulting discovery of new alternative ends. What is the best way to produce something? Well then, and what are the consumer preferences will determine what the costs of production are. And for the neoclassicals, it's objective and constant, such that a third party can know and measure it. So it's, again, useful for cost to be objective and constant, because then it will fit nicely into our mathematical equation that someone can measure. But costs are dynamic. The preferences of today are not definitely going to be the preferences of tomorrow. If a study comes out that, let's say, this food that was considered really bad is really good, and the food that was considered really good is really bad for your health, then preferences will evolve. They'll change over time. So, yes. In firm-level profit maximization, traditional economic theory assumes firms aim to maximize profits within their cost constraints. However, firms often face additional constraints beyond cost. Factors such as cultural norms and personal preferences can also influence decision-making and constrain profit maximization. This speaks to subjective values. In formalism, Austrians are verbal, abstract and formal logic which introduces subjective time and human creativity. For the neoclassicals, it's mathematical formalism, which is symbolic language typical of the analysis of atemporal and constant phenomena. What this means is that if you look at a lot of the books of the Austrians, you won't see these mathematical equations. It has been considered literary economics, but there's no other way to explain subjective values, the origins of money, entrepreneurial creativity. I don't know how you synthesize this in mathematical models. So they don't. They don't have models for human consciousness and creativity, which is so fundamental to humans and how we live in the real world. Moreover, mathematics was used to, I forget where I was reading this, but that it was used, which eventually should be then transformed back into literary concepts. So I guess what I mean is that even if you use a mathematical equation, it's only explained by how you explain it using words, because just seeing these symbols will mean nothing if you don't understand the symbols. It's like seeing hieroglyphs. How do I know what the hieroglyphs are saying if I don't know what the symbols mean and what the symbols represent? So for the neoclassicals, there's an emphasis on mathematical modeling with well-behaved functions, heavy reliance on mathematical models with specific assumptions, monotonic functions, quasi-concave functions, continuous functions, twice differentiable functions. Please don't ask me about these functions. Maybe ask Professor Durkin. Yes?
So we're talking a bit about the differences between the schools in terms of like ideology, approach, and I guess like the specifics, functions that you could use. What has the neoclassical school contributed in a positive way? Because presumably the math netted them something, right?
Yes. You know, a lot of Austrians do argue that there is a use for mathematics, and I guess the perhaps Professor Durjan would be able to answer that. But if I may take a step at the positive contributions of the neoclassical school, well, I think a lot of them would say that they helped, I guess, formalize economics. Maybe we'll come back to this question. Critiques of the neoclassical approach. The symbols represent human preferences and choices unrealistically. Assumptions of identical people and simplified groupings. Mathematical modeling may not reflect heterogeneous populations. And the methodology as unsuitable for economics. And mainstream research as often disconnected from real-world complexity. So, the relationship with the empirical world, for the Austrians, it's the a prioristic deductive reasoning, radical separation and simultaneous coordination between theory, science, and history, art. History cannot validate theories. The neoclassical's empirical validation of hypotheses, at least rhetorically. Mises, one of his 4 great books, Theory and History, really writes about history and what history is. And he asks, is history an art? And it's very interesting, but I think it's kind of illuminating to what history actually is for a lot of the Austrians. History doesn't have a place in the theoretical sense. That's why there's a distinction between history and theory for the Austrians, that history is just things that have happened, and the way we recall history for the neoclassicals is through statistics and data aggregation. But history cannot validate theories. So history in itself is not a theory. It is what has occurred, and we create our theories based off of history, which I think is interesting. So for the neoclassicals, it's an emphasis on empirical and statistical methods. Neoclassical economics often emphasizes empirical and statistical methods, relying on inductive reasoning to develop theories. This approach involves deriving general conclusions from specific observations and data, similar to the scientific method in the natural sciences. So, empiricism, this is the idea of testing and either verifying or falsifying a certain claim or hypothesis. Whereas for the Austrians, it's the deductive approach, the methodology, beginning with a premise, a true claim. We can derive our other laws of economics, or any other science for that matter that uses a deductive approach. And empiricism is very much the methodology of the natural sciences. Moreover, statistics is important for the neoclassicals, and it's also interesting to note that etymologically, the term statistic comes from the word state, or estat, I believe in Latin. And Lenin said that the Bureau of Statistics is the most important, bureau for a government. So if you're using statistics, I think Austrians would caution you to be careful in what you're using the statistics for. And also, I think it was attributed to Stalin, but not necessarily true, that the death of one man is a tragedy, but the death of millions is a statistic or something like that. Yeah. So there's an emphasis on empirical and statistical methods. Inductive reasoning assumes that future events will follow the same patterns as past events. While this can be a useful approach, it does not guarantee certainty. Philosophers like David Hume have highlighted the problematics of induction, pointing out that past regularities do not necessarily ensure future occurrences. For example, in some Native American cultures, probably other cultures as well, but using human sacrifices to please the sun god, to make the sun rise again, may have its correlations, but it's a matter of causality that can ultimately determine whether this claim is true or valid or legit. But I think obviously we can see the common sense in hindsight that human sacrifices are not what brings up the sun to rise every morning. Yes, the applicational limitations of the statistical and empirical methods is that economic behaviors and trends observed in the past may not necessarily predict future behaviors due to changing and unforeseen circumstances, innovations, and other dynamic factors. Like I said, preferences are dynamic, they're evolving over time, and just because people like this product one day does not necessarily imply that they will like it in the future indefinitely. Economic regularities and laws. Economics, unlike empirical sciences, often relies on axioms and laws considered universal. These are derived from logical deduction. Examples include law of demand: as price increases, quantity demanded generally decreases, ceteris paribus, all else being equal. Law of supply: as price increases, quantity supplied generally increases. Diminishing marginal utility: additional satisfaction from consuming an extra unit decreases as consumption increases. Diminishing marginal product: in the short run, adding more of one production factor while holding others constant eventually yields lower additional output. Law of association: trade is beneficial when parties specialize in goods where they have a comparative advantage, even if one is less efficient in producing all goods. The theory of interest rates balance time preference for consumption between the present and the future. I think Mises regarded one of these laws of marginal utility as one of the, well, okay. He said that it was a great law of economics, but I'm not recalling correctly what he was referring to. Let me see. So for the Austrians, their approach, and in the Mengerian sense, is what's considered as causal realism. Causal being this idea of cause and effect. We live in a world of cause and effect. We can't even comprehend a world that's not of cause and effect. It wouldn't be comprehensible to us. And the realist application, meaning that we're observing the real world. Unlike the Neoclassicals, who are, again, trying to model the real world and simplifying the world in order to break it down into mathematical equations. So it's a different perspective on economics. And economics, unlike empirical sciences. So for the Austrians, economics is not an empirical science. It's not a natural science. It's a social science. We're looking at observing, analyzing, studying human beings as they are in life and consciousness. We're not observing rocks or elements or atoms and how they can, as well being causal, be affected by these certain different combinations of factors. Yes? The axiomatic foundation. Economic theories often rest on foundational axioms considered self-evidently true. Again, the axiom of action, the action axiom. The assumption that individuals act to maximize their subjective preferences is foundational for many economic models. But as we have continued to state, that people are not just acting to maximize their utility, but again, this has to be assumed for the mathematical economic models. Regularities and predictability. Unlike tentative hypotheses in empirical sciences, many economic laws are treated as robust and reliable. This approach makes economics distinct in forming and validating theories. So, the possibilities of specific prediction. And this again speaks to the heart of the distinction between the Austrian school and the Neoclassical school. Why are we approaching economics as the way we are? For the Austrians, it's to observe and understand the real world civilization. For the Austrians, impossible in regards to predictions, as future events rely on entrepreneurial knowledge that has yet to be generated. Only qualitative and theoretical predictions about the disruptive effects of interventionism can be made. So we can make somewhat predictions, not specifically, but qualitative predictions about each intervention that the government may impose on the society and the coming distortions. The causal relationship. For the Neoclassicals, prediction is an objective which is deliberately pursued. So the question of why are we doing economics the way we do it, and in regards for the Neoclassicals, is to make predictions about the real world. Because if you can make predictions about the real world, then it gives you quite a heavy hand in influencing policymakers, in influencing governments. That's why most PhD economists go work for the Federal Reserve, which is really an arm of the state, if you will, even though it's private in name. But as Mises said, an economist, at least in the Austrians' approach, as he referred to them, are mischief makers for policymakers. Because they tell them what economics is and what the limitations of the government's ability to use money is in a society. So governments don't like that. The person responsible for making predictions for the Austrians is the entrepreneur. Anyone can be an entrepreneur in the sense that you act to pursue your self-interest in the division of labor. Just because you take up employment, it benefits you, you can get paid for it. So this is classified as an entrepreneurial action. But for the Neoclassicals, it's the economic analysis or the social engineering. And this term social engineer, I do think should be correlated with the ideas of progressives and progressivism. This is what used to be regarded by communists until they dropped the word communist. Now they go by progressives. But social engineering is this idea of what? Engineering society, engineering what's in the society, people, engineering people. Not just engineering bridges and material objects, like physicists can do, but the economist wants to engineer not these material, inanimate objects, but the material objects of society, which are people. So the current state of the paradigm, or the current state of economics, Austrians, remarkable resurgence over the last 25 years, and this book was published roughly 15, 20 years ago, particularly following the crisis of Keynesianism and the collapse of real socialism. So the collapse of real socialism being in regards to the Soviet Union in '91, and the crisis of Keynesian being in the 1970s with stagflation, where you had both inflation and high unemployment, which was a big dagger to the Keynesian paradigm of economic theory. And for the Neoclassicals, state of crisis and rapid change. Yes, the Austrian school is flourishing all over the world. This is, I would argue, the newest emergence of Austrian community and scholars. It's in Los Angeles. There's Austrian communities, which I've seen in Spain. There's a growing one in Poland, all over the world. Of course, in Vienna, the motherland. Auburn, Alabama, with the Mises Institute. In Prague, all over. Probably, of course, Brazil, Latin America, Argentina, places that I'm not even familiar with. But late 20th century, and in the beginning of the 21st century, which we're in the 20th century, it was mostly Mises and Hayek and some of his students that were considered the Austrian. So this is more of like libertarian Austro-economic history, but anyways. The amount of human capital invested, a minority, though it's increasing, and the neoclassical paradigm, the majority thought there are signs of dispersal and disintegration. So I can't recall the statistic correctly, and it was kind of an observational statistic. And I heard it, I believe, from Curtis Arvin, who said that for every Keynesian or neoclassical economist, there's about 10 or 20 Chicago school economists. And then for every Chicago school, it was like 10 or 20 Chicago school economists, there's one Austrian. So Austrians have been the minority, most definitely within economics and the study thereof, but it's growing. So I believe that ratio will rapidly change. Yeah. So the type of human capital invested. For the Austrians, multidisciplinary theorists and philosophers, radical libertarians. For the neoclassicals, specialists in economic intervention, piecemeal social engineering, and an extremely variable degree of commitment to freedom. Austrians much more of a degree of commitment to freedom. And the most recent contributions: critical analysis of institutional coercion, socialism and intervention, theory of free banking and economic cycles, evolutionary theory of juridical, moral institutions, theory of entrepreneurship, critical analysis of social justice, Professor Jurgen's analysis of human nature, and I will mention my own analysis of suicidality. The neoclassical paradigm: public choice theory, economic analysis of the family, economic analysis of law, neoclassical macroeconomics, economics of information, New Keynesians. Boring stuff. For the neoclassicals, governmental intervention in economics. Neoclassical economics traditionally supports government intervention. This is why it's favored amongst governments, why it's subsidized so heavily. And the Austrian school is not favored by governments. In regards to monetary policy, money supply, central banks regulate the amount of money in circulation to control inflation, manage economic growth, unemployment, and stabilize the currency. In regards to interest rates, by setting benchmark interest rates, central banks influence borrowing and lending activities, which can stimulate or cool down economic activity. And this is more of a monetary and fiscal policy, which I'll try to cover in the Keynesian macroeconomic sequential lecture. Fiscal policy: taxation. Governments collect taxes to fund public services and infrastructure, redistribute wealth, and influence economic behavior. Government expenditure: spending on public goods and services such as healthcare, education, and defense to address societal needs. And continuing legislative policy: labor policies, regulations on wages, working conditions, and labor rights, trade policies, tariffs, trade agreements, and import-export regulation. Influence international trade flows. I remember when I first got to Occidental, my first semester, before I really met Professor Georgian, I was in a sociology class, and we were talking about minimum wage laws in Los Angeles, and I was asking him, I'm like, my basic understanding of economics was that if you increase minimum wage, all else being equal, won't there be a decrease in employment? Because as wages rise, then some people don't meet the marginal productivity of that wage, so they don't get hired at all. And he said, well, actually, there's new studies by economists saying that if you increase the minimum wage, employment will rise. Wow. Why don't we just keep increasing minimum wage? Why not just pay everyone $1 million an hour? But that speaks to the neoclassical school and their studies and empirical methods of not looking at economics as something of a deductive, theoretical science, but something that's empirical. That if we can take this event, this observation, and if we just apply the right theory, then we can essentially validate whatever our theory is. So for example, in Los Angeles, if we increase minimum wage and employment goes up, well, how can we explain this? We can say it's because minimum wage has increased, that's why employment has gone up. But there could be other factors, variables, that we're not seeing that contributed to the increase in employment. It could be that, I don't know, we had a new resurgence of Puritanism, and everyone just wanted to work, so they all wanted to get a job, right? So then employment could have gone up. Whatever the reason is, that's not the important thing. The important distinction is that our understanding of economics in the neoclassical framework is that we don't have these laws of economics. We just have to continually test until we get the result that we want, and it justifies, therefore, what we want to do. So, the rationale for government intervention. Market failures. You'll see market failures all over neoclassical economic ideas, that markets fail. And government intervention is often justified in the cases of alleged market failures, such as externalities, public goods, and information asymmetries. And we will get into the future pillars about market failures. But I love the concept that I heard from Professor Jurgen, that markets don't fail, governments do. So, in our understanding of economics, it could be that a prior intervention, whether just purely in the monetary matters, could have caused a distortion for a certain service to not occur or come about. Or maybe it's that this service hasn't been able to come about due to some regulatory matters, and then people will see that there's no market for this certain service or good, and they say, well, this is a market failure, therefore, this vacuum of service, it's the government's job to provide. But I like this analogy that, like, just because it's dark out and you can't see doesn't mean that the objects in front of you are not there. It just means you can't see it. So I think a lot of economic understanding can be applied in that sense, that just because people don't see how certain services and the creation of certain goods could come about, doesn't mean they can't come about. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the government is the preferred alternative or the only alternative to providing these certain goods and services. In economic stability, through monetary and fiscal policies, governments aim to stabilize the economy, reduce unemployment, and control inflation. Equity in society and social welfare, legislative policies can address issues of equity. And we'll get to social welfare. But I like the term welfare, as Mises puts it, that like to be against welfare means like you're against people. But that's not the case. It's this newspeak of using words to your own ends, even if they don't necessarily imply what is actually implemented in practice. So I have a couple more slides, and I'll try to go through them with the remaining time. In welfare analysis and cardinal utility in neoclassical economics, policymakers use specific cardinal numerical values to rank subjective preferences, making it easier to apply mathematical models and perform quantitative analysis. Second, by assigning cardinal values to individual utilities, policymakers can aggregate these utilities across individuals, allowing for a collective assessment of welfare. Third, this approach erroneously enables policymakers to compare utilities between individuals, ostensibly justifying decisions that affect the distribution of welfare. Criticisms of cardinal utility in neoclassical welfare analysis. Preferences are subjective and not possible to measure, and this is the idea of interpersonal marginal utility comparison. Love, great example. Maybe I love Gabriel and I love Ethan, but I cannot quantify my love for these two individuals. I can't say I love Gabriel 3 times as much as Ethan. How does that even make sense? Because these aspects of human life and our subjective preferences and values are not quantifiable. However, quantities are useful in the methods of the empirical and mathematical aspects of not just the natural sciences, but the neoclassical framework to economics. Going off of that, cardinal utility is the idea of using numbers to rank things. But with the Austrians, we use what's called ordinal ranking, which is ordering based on our preferences. So I have a cup of coffee, water, and let's say orange juice. I'm drinking the coffee, so I prefer it to the water, and then I'll drink the water, and thirdly, I'll prefer the orange juice. But I'm not quantifying my preferences. These are just ordering my preferences. But again, quantities are useful for the mathematical method. Utilitarianism advocates for policies that maximize the overall well-being of the greatest number of people. These welfare engineers justify redistribution by making interpersonal utility comparisons founded on diminishing marginal utility. So this is the idea of $1 is less valuable to the billionaire than it is to the homeless person. And what they're trying to say is that, well, therefore, this justifies that we can take $1 from the billionaire and give it to the homeless person. But maybe the billionaire needed the extra dollar to find a cure to world hunger or poverty or a cure for cancer. So is that more valuable than the homeless person's dollar? I mean, I don't want to bash homeless, but I'm just saying that this is an aspect of marginal utility comparison, that people are using their resources for different things, subjective values, that we cannot compare. I cannot say that me and my desire to go to the beach outweighs someone else's desire to go to a restaurant. If we're sharing the resources, like let's say a car, to get to where we want to go, well, we'll have to discuss and find a solution to who's going to use the car and for what purpose. But these things are not reducible to quantities, and yet they are trying to reduce these things to quantities. Yes?
Can I make a statement?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'm a little bit of the enemy in the room, and then I work for government, and I'm working government adjacent now, and FDR is kind of my hero. But
Why didn't you tell me that?
But the thing for me about neoclassical economics is why it was successful is because when people are suffering, you have to give them something. You can't say we have nothing for you, right? So to me, like the market works, but it works over time. And people live in a now. People want to eat now. They want to have their house now. And so that's to me, that's the, I don't know, the tension.
Yep.
And so when they say, I'm starving, they don't want to hear, well, over time it's going to work itself out, which is what Hoover did. But they wanted, again, people wanted to have it fixed now. And so if that's saying, look, we think we can fix it and here's how, even if it's wrong, people will want something to feel like they're being, something's happening and not just suffering and helpless. Anyways, that's my...
Well, if I may give my 2 cents,
Yeah.
and perhaps we'll conclude on this. But in regards to now, I think the neoclassicals really forego the temporal dimension of what creates prosperity. They say, well, we have this prosperity now, and we can redistribute it. But I think if we look around the world in cases where there are poverty, the only way to really lift people sustainably out of poverty is if they develop the factors of production that require or allow capital accumulation to occur, and which will sustainably lead to their own prosperity. But Mises says, and this I think really goes into the heart of socialism, that the couch you burn today cannot be used tomorrow for warmth, for heat. So although we can use methods of redistribution now, Murray Rothbard really in his book America's Great Depression dissects Hoover as not a free market advocate. And I think that's really the idea that, yeah, we could help people now, but what will help people generations from now is if we allow the process of the market and capital accumulation to flourish unlimitedly. And I think, I think this goes into, we could probably in the future discuss like the economics of like healthcare and medical services.
Yeah.
Should the provision of healthcare be something that the government provides, or is it better to have markets provide it? Because, as some would say, healthcare, medical care is a human right. But again, we can answer, is it better to have the government provide it, or should markets provide it? So the temporal dimension of production structures, I'll cover a little bit more in my next lecture, I think is really overlooked by the neoclassicals, because it would be great if we all had peace and prosperity right now. But the only way to get there is through the time and understanding that the stages of production of civilization it needs the foundation of capital accumulation. And to undermine that really undermines the future capital. So that is my time. Thank you guys very much.